So how will you determine the virtual certainty or reasonable certainty? Reasonable level of certainty you will evaluate on the basis of facts and circumstances, which will include the current business as well as the past record of the enterprise, and then by making realistic estimate of the profit for the future. Now, definitely, it should not happen that okay, yes, the company has been in losses for last 5 years, or only in marginal profit with 5% profitability, but suddenly you expect that yes, oh, before expiry of losses, the company will make 40% profit every year. Now, those kind of unrealistic estimate will not support the reasonable level of certainty projection or assumption. So the company has to be very careful. And if we are auditors or if we are advising the company, then we also need to be careful that what is the basis to support this reasonable level of certainty assumption which management is taking. Now, as I already explained that, okay, if you are in a carried forward or unabsorbed depreciation situation, the threshold move from reasonable certainty to virtual certainty. Virtual certainty which has to be supported by convincing evidence. Now, determination of virtual certainty that is available is a matter of judgment and based on convincing evidence and will have to be evaluated on a case-to-case basis. Now, if you look at in a common parallels, if I look at it, and this is how I have been explaining to everyone that, okay, we all go and buy gold. Uh, the standards expectation is that when you are applying virtual certainty, ideally you should not be allowed to reverse deferred tax asset tomorrow. Otherwise, there will always be a question on your virtual certainty assessment, unless it is triggered by something which is beyond your control or you could not have estimated. Now, so when you look at from the gold perspective, it is more like a 24 karat gold. That's what standard is expecting, that you have a 24 karat gold. There is no mixing, there is nothing, and that's what you will get it. Uh, so whenever you are determining virtual certainty, please, that it should be all supported by fact, and there are various opinions issued by Institute of Chartered Accountant of India, as well as enough guidance and interpretation. Practical examples are available where only forecast or a business plan or projection is not considered to be a sufficient convincing evidence to determine virtual certainty. The opinions have specifically stated that maybe a binding contract. If you already have a binding contract which cannot be cancelled, non-cancelable binding contract, which has a profitability, can be considered as a convincing evidence. But only saying that, okay, yes, my history has been this, and on this basis, I expect that I will have a profitability, or based on my budget approval, I will have a profitability in absence of any uh, non-cancelable binding contract. It is assumed that you will not meet the threshold of virtual certainty, and ideally, you should not recognize any deferred tax asset only if you are in a unabsorbed depreciation or carry forward of losses situation. Now, this slide captures one example which I just talked about: a profitable binding export order, cancellation of which will result in a payment of heavy damages by the defaulting party. On the other hand, a projection of future profit made by enterprise based on future capital expenditure, future restructuring submitted even to an outside agency, to a credit agency, in isolation cannot be considered as a convincing evidence. Now, this is a very important distinction, and lots of companies uh, have always challenged it, and I think regulators and standard setters have always been consistent in saying that, okay, yes, virtual certainty is a very high level of threshold, and you can meet generally only when you have non-cancelable binding orders. Projection alone will not help. Projection can help as additional evidence, but but not as the sole convincing evidence to determine virtual certainty. So this is very important from AS22 perspective, uh, which I want all of you to remember whenever you are applying this. So I think there is one question that losses should not be happened in any of the previous year. Uh, so I think the answer is if you are evaluating reasonable certainty, in that case, the requirement is not that, okay, you should not have incurred any losses. If you incurred losses, but you came in profit, you are not in accumulated loss situation as of now, in the year in which you are evaluating deferred tax asset recognition, in that case, your past losses will not have any impact on your reasonable certainty assumption. Okay. Yes, you can move to reasonable certainty. However, while doing estimation of future income, you need to consider that why those losses were incurred and whether it is expected that those losses may also incur in future period. Now that's how you will do the adjustment in future period taxable income determination. But you can, since you don't have any accumulated depreciation or unabsorbed depreciation or losses, you can very well move to reasonable certainty assumption. Just because you had losses in past, but that has been all offset by the future in subsequent period, you will not be restricted to apply reasonable certainty assumption. Okay, so I think that was the question. This is what my understanding, but if it is not the same, you can again write the question and I'll try to address it. Now then the standard says once you have recognized, that's very good, but your assumptions can always undergo a change. Like say for example, you are not in an accumulated loss situation today, but tomorrow you may be unfortunately in accumulated loss situation, and suddenly you will move from the carry forward losses perspective, carry forward deferred tax on timing difference perspective, from reasonable certainty to virtual certainty, right? So what standard says is that you should evaluate deferred tax asset or do the reassessment at each balance sheet date, not only for unrecognized deferred tax asset, but also for recognized deferred tax asset. In both cases, you should do that reassessment at each balance sheet date. Because if you have not recognized in the past, your condition may improve today and you will be able to recognize, or it can be vice versa as well. So at each balance sheet date, you should evaluate your deferred tax asset or liability balances. Now that was on recognition. Now, if you look at it from the measurement perspective, that how we should do the measurement. Now the measurement is current tax should be as per the tax computation by applying the tax rate applicable for that particular year as per the tax law. So this is very straightforward and all of us understand this, right? Now deferred tax asset and liability should be measured by using the tax rate which is already enacted or substantively enacted by the balance sheet date. Now, effectively, the reason we talk about the enacted or substantively enacted, if it is already enacted, if there is no change as compared to last year, then effectively you have no problem. You apply the same rate as your current tax. But in India, generally we get our budget sometime in February, and then sometime there is a change in tax rate, which may be applicable in future period, right? From next year onwards, that's what the rate will be. Now that's where I think there has been a debate that okay, whether that should be considered as substantively enacted or no. Generally, as a practice, this is considered as substantively enacted from future perspective because it is presented in February and thereafter the Parliament session and everything happens, and before we actually sign off for March accounts, this is considered as substantively enacted, and that's the rate which you apply, which we apply from deferred tax measurement perspective. So generally, you will have if there is a rate change in any budget, you will have two rates, one applicable for current tax because that is applicable for current year, and one for deferred taxes. But you know the situation every time we have to see that okay, what kind of changes are there, because sometimes the tax rate changes or surcharges and others may or may not happen through budget, may happen through other announcements, especially in today's uncertain times, and we should just take care of that from overall perspective. Now, review of deferred tax asset, we already talked about that we should evaluate that every period. Like I have dealt with a situation where the company recognized deferred tax to the extent of say 150 crore because they were in reasonable certainty situation. There was no accumulated loss, and suddenly just because something happened in a particular year, they actually moved into losses situation. So at year end, for next year, they were actually in accumulated loss situation, and they had to reverse that DTA of 150 crore. So my suggestion is that always look at this particular thing at each balance sheet date. This is extremely important. Now we'll be happy to take some questions if there are any. Let me just go through the chat box. There is a comment that it should be evaluated on each reporting date. Yeah, the balance sheet date and reporting date will be exactly the same. If you're doing MIS on monthly basis, my suggestion is that okay, that is also each balance sheet date. While from statutory perspective, it will be the quarter or annual. But even if you're doing MIS, you should actually evaluate at each balance sheet date. Otherwise, you will have a surprise at quarter end. So there are no comments in chat box. So maybe we can move to presentation and disclosure. So if you look at from disclosure perspective, should offset asset and liabilities representing current tax if enterprise has a legal enforceable right to set off the recognized amount. Now this is also one of the point that okay, whether we should net off advanced tax against provision. Now definitely for a particular year you have that right to offset available, and in that case it should be on net basis. An enterprise will normally have a legal enforceable right to offset representing current tax if it is within the same jurisdiction. If you are not in the same jurisdiction, if you are a multinational company and you have advanced tax in one and provision in other, then it should be on separate basis. Then it should not be netted off. So we should evaluate whether we have a right to offset, yes or no. If we have right to offset, then we can do it on net basis. Otherwise, it should be on gross basis. Similarly, for deferred tax asset or liability as well, same thing will be applicable. The breakup of deferred tax asset and liability by component should be disclosed in notes to account. And when we say components, means that you may have deferred tax asset on 43B liability, you may have a deferred tax liability on depreciation, you may have deferred tax asset on losses, you may have deferred tax liability on some higher deduction. So effectively, in that case, you should show the breakup in notes to accounts that how much deferred tax asset is recognized on which component. And then what is the evidence supporting the recognition of deferred tax asset? We should also disclose if you are in an unabsorbed depreciation or carry forward. So whether it is a contract, whether it is something else, how you determine your virtual certainty assessment. I think what we should do is we should wait for maybe a couple of minutes. If any one of you have any question before we move on to AS28, we'll be happy to answer. See, it is important that we interact with each other, and if you are facing any practical challenge or if you want to share anything with the group, that will be extremely useful because it is all about the knowledge sharing or your experience sharing. So there is a question that deferred tax, no effect of permanent difference. Yes. So if you have a permanent difference, then what are the permanent difference? So let me just give you an example. The weighted average R&D deduction, we used to get 150% or 200%. Now, when you look at it in the book, you will have 100% of the expenditure, while in tax, you will claim 150. So that additional 50% is actually permanent. That will never be reversed. Or similarly, say 80 IA tax exemption, right? So if your profit is exempt, that will not be reversed in future period. So in that case, you should not, that is effectively nothing but your permanent difference. Similarly, we used to have this any exempted income. If you get any interest dividend which is exempt, that is a permanent difference. So that we don't need to recognize any deferred tax asset or liability. There is a point, what are the major differences between AS 22 and Ind AS 12? One of the major difference, I will talk about a couple of differences, but one of the major differences, timing difference versus temporary difference. Now, if you see AS 22, we went through the timing difference definition. What is timing difference is you have your taxable income computation and you have your booked income, P&L computation. If there is a difference between the two, we segregate into permanent and timing. But when we go to Ind AS 12, it talks about the balance sheet approach, which is the temporary difference. And I give you one example. One of the example is, let us assume you get this entire indexation benefit, right? That indexation benefit, so on your land or your investment, you don't have any, and you have not sold it, you are just holding it. Let us assume from the long-term perspective. In your books, you will carry at cost or market price, whatever is there, right? But let us assume we are carrying at cost, and cost is 100 rupees. As far as tax is concerned, if it is for long-term purpose, you are effectively adding indexation benefit to the cost. So every year the cost is going up. Let us assume the indexation benefit is 6 rupees in a year. So at the end of the first year, you have 100 rupees as a cost in books, but 106 as a cost in tax. Now both have not hit P&L, neither taxable P&L nor your accounting P&L. So from AS 22 perspective, you will not consider that because this is not a timing difference as per the definition. But when you look at the balance sheet and you prepare it, effectively you have 106 versus 100 as your cost of investment, right, which you are carrying. Now that is what will become a temporary difference, which you have to analyze from recognition perspective. So this is one big difference between Ind AS 12 and AS 22. The second big difference which you will see from practical perspective is the virtual certainty which we talked about, that that you need to have binding contract and all those things, and forecast alone will not be sufficient. From Ind AS 12 perspective, that distinction is not there. There is a commentary definitely that if you are in an accumulated loss situation, forecast alone is not sufficient. Now, definitely it is a higher level of threshold, but which you need to apply when you are looking at it, but definitely not a virtual certainty. You need to prove that your reasonable certainty assumption is very well documented, articulated, and assessed from any uncertainty perspective. But that virtual certainty and reasonable certainty distinction from standard recognition perspective is not there. So I think these are the two big differences if you really look at it from AS 22 and Ind AS 12 perspective. So there is a question on expenses disallowed under income tax, but adjusted in book profit. See, if there is any expenditure which will not be allowed under income tax, will fall into a permanent category. Because you may have hit your P&L, but you are never going to get any kind of a benefit. So you will not have any kind of a deferred tax expenditure. So there is a comment that what happens to CSR. So if CSR is not allowed as a taxable tax deductible item, then there is no deferred tax. It becomes a permanent difference for you. I think there is a question on CSR allowed as expense or not. I am not a tax expert on this, and it all depends upon what kind of expenditure you are incurring. Generally, as CSR, My personal view is that, okay, it is not allowed, but I am not expert on tax side. So please don't take it as the final word. Please consult with your tax expert on this. I think there are no more comments, so maybe we can move to AS28. Let me just share that presentation with all of you. So if you go to AS, hello, whether the screen is visible?
Yes, sir. Visible, sir.
There is a comment, so maybe I have 2 minutes to address that. So someone has asked, can you sum up the standard in few minutes? Just to recall, and there are a couple of comments actually asking me to summarize. So let me explain it to you. And this I will explain it to you more from the perspective of, let us assume if you are having an Excel, then how you should go methodically, because this is more method driven deferred tax computation, okay, from Indian perspective. And all of us have always prepared bank reconciliation statements. So I'm just assuming from that perspective, this is very similar to that exercise. So you have your P&L as per accounting books. So where you have your revenue or income side, and then you have your all expenses. So you start with, say, profit as per books. And this is what the book says. Similarly, like we do as bank balance as per book. Okay, so very similar to that. And then you start assessing, and then you have second sheet, which is your taxable income, where you anyway start with the accounting profitability, right? For each and every reconciliation or each and every item, let us assume 43B expenses disallowed. You will add, let us assume you start with 100 rupees as profitability, you add say 10 rupees as your non-deductible expenditure, which is allowed on payment basis. So you add 10 rupees. And then let us assume your book depreciation is 10 rupees, but your income tax depreciation is 15. So you effectively say excess of depreciation, which is 5 rupees, which you are claiming in tax. So that's how your number will go down to say 100 plus 10 minus 5. So effectively you will have 105 as your taxable income. And assume 30% is your tax rate. In that case, what happens is you add 2 more columns against your tax computation. You say whether it's a temporary difference or whether it's a permanent difference. Both of these are temporary difference, right? Because depreciation, tomorrow you will get less. 43B liability, you will get deduction as and when you will make the payment. So both will fall in that timing difference column. You do the total, and then effectively total means you look at the side very carefully, whether it's a asset, whether you will get deduction in future or whether you will get less deduction in future. If you get less deduction in future, then it should be minus. So say for example, depreciation should be minus 5, while that you will get a higher deduction in future, which is 10 rupees. So that should be plus. So effectively, you end up having 5 rupees as plus, apply 30%, which is your assuming it's the same substantively enacted rate. You apply 30%, you effectively get a 1.5 rupees as your deferred tax computation. Now, this is what the standard is talking about. Now, when you will recognize this 1.5 rupees, when you have a reasonable certainty that there will be a future taxable income. Because if you are not going to get this deduction, and even if you get this deduction, if you are going to be in losses, then effectively you don't earn anything tomorrow, right? So in that case, what they say is please don't recognize, then the applicable rate is 0%. But if you are going to recognize it, then the applicable rate is 30% in this case. So this is what the crux of this particular standard is, where we need to be careful that how we recognize. And this is an arithmetical Excel spreadsheet which you should apply. Just be careful on the side, whether it's a DTL or whether it's a DTA. Okay. So I think now we move to AS28. AS28 talks about impairment of asset for any kind of asset which we have in our books, except inventories, because it's covered in AS2. Assets arising from construction contract, because that is covered in 7 and 11. Financial assets including investments, because that is already covered in AS13. And then deferred tax asset, because that is already covered in 22. We just talked about a reasonable certainty and virtual certainty at the time of recognition itself, and then the reassessment required as per standard. So otherwise, all other assets, the impairment is covered in AS28. Now there are few definitions. I would not get into very detail, but at least touch upon some of these definitions before we move on. What is the recoverable amount? As all of us understand that, okay, whatever we are going to get by selling that particular asset or by using that particular asset is your recoverable amount, right? Since we can use that particular asset or we can sell that particular asset, that's why the standard has defined as higher of whether it's a net selling price or value in use. Because any businessman will decide whether he will be more beneficial, right? Or it will be more beneficial for that person, that company, to sell that asset or to use that asset. Because if you believe that you are going to get, by selling that particular asset, you are going to get say 10 crore rupees profit, as opposed to using it for 20 years, you will get only 5 or 1 crore profit from the present value perspective, you will better sell it as opposed to running it, unless you have any kind of a compulsion or there is any kind of a loss, that anyway you will evaluate. But so the standard has said that, okay, whatever is higher of net selling price or value in use. Now, what is value in use? Is the present value of your future cash flow which you will generate by using that particular asset over a useful life. And net selling price is nothing but the selling price at the arm's length transaction less cost of disposal. What is cost of disposal? All of us understand that, okay, this is only the incremental cost which is directly attributable to the disposal of an asset. It will not include any of your finance cost or income tax expense. And what is the impairment loss? Before coming to impairment loss, let us understand carrying amount. What is carrying amount? Carrying amount is the amount at which that asset is carried in the balance sheet. Now, what should be the impairment? We are testing impairment for any asset. What we need to do? We need to compare carrying amount against what? Recoverable amount. And impairment will be when your carrying amount is more than your recoverable amount. If your carrying amount is 100 and your recoverable amount is only 80, effectively you have a 20 rupees impairment which you should recognize today. That's what the standard is talking about, and the standard is talking about that how you should determine your recoverable amount and how you should determine your carrying amount, and what are the rules surrounding these two concepts, right? And ultimately you recognize your impairment loss. The depreciation we all understand, useful life we all understand, so I'll not get into that. There is one important concept which is cash generating unit. Now, this is very important. Let us assume a Tata Steel or say Bharti Airtel. They have so many towers, or any other, or say Titan or Tanishq or Starbucks. They will have so many stores, right? In a particular city, in a particular country, any manufacturing company will have so many plants. So is it possible to do this assessment for each and every asset class every period? The answer is no, or for any asset, individual asset. So the standard has said that, okay, there is a concept called cash generating unit. What is cash generating unit? The way it is defined is the smallest identifiable group of assets. So you can group certain assets, but how will you group? You have to test that the group of assets should generate cash flow from continuing use that are largely independent of cash flow from other asset or group of assets. So if you have a particular plant which is generating a particular type of cash flow, cash inflow, okay, which is not dependent on use or any other asset, any other group of asset, it becomes a CGU. So what they say is any asset within that particular CGU will be tested as a group. So one asset realizable value may be less, but because that is contributing to the cash inflow generation for that CGU, effectively it will be tested at a group level. So this concept is very important and we will be covering that in detail. But always remember, you can always do test at individual asset level or at a group level. And group in standard is defined as cash generating unit, which is any group of asset which can generate inflow from continuing use that are largely independent of cash flow from other asset or group of assets. Now then there are corporate assets. Corporate assets are those assets which are contributing to more than one cash generating unit and which are not independent. Now then there is active market just to evaluate your net selling price and other stuff. When you're not selling it, how will you get it? Because then it should be at arm's length transaction between two knowledgeable parties. Now we discussed that, okay, when an asset will be impaired, if its recoverable amount is less than carrying amount. Now when you should assess it? Definitely at each balance sheet date, where there is an indication that an asset may be impaired. If any such indication exists, the enterprise should estimate the recoverable amount. Now, definitely the rule is that, okay, it should be evaluated at each balance sheet date. Now, what is the first step? The first step is to see whether there is any indication that an asset may be impaired. And if such indication exists, then you go to the recoverable amount determination. Now, how will you evaluate whether there is an indication or not? So when you are doing that indication assessment, which is called as indicator assessment, you effectively look at both type of information available, whether it's external or internal. And the standard has given guidance of, okay, what kind of information. While that is not the exhaustive list, you may have other factors as well. But they have said that you should evaluate all factors available before concluding whether there is an indication, yes or no. So some of the factors are an asset market value has declined significantly, or significant changes with an adverse effect on the enterprise have taken place during the period. There is a technological, market, economic, or legal environment changes. Let us assume you are using a particular technology and that technology product is no longer sellable in the market. You suddenly have a impairment indicator. The market has changed. So these are all your external business environment which you need to consider. The market interest rate has changed significantly. We used to do impairment assessment at say 7% last time, and suddenly the interest rate has gone to 15% in the current year because of inflation and other factors. And suddenly, if you look at it, some balance sheets, when we went to last March, say for example, just after the pandemic was announced, like first lockdown, the market crashed. Now, some of the entities may have gone like below book value, the market price at that point in time. Now, that is a straightforward indication to start with. It's not necessary that you will end up doing impairment, but there is an indication that the market capitalization has gone below book value. So in that case, you need to do your assessment. Now, what are the internal sources of information? There is a physical damage, obsolescence. Again, significant changes in your budgeting process. Your budget is indicating that actual performance is lower than this, and the future will be lower than your actual performance or earlier estimate. You may have changed your expectations. Say, for example, there is a particular a plant which was catering to high margin product, and suddenly the demand is gone, and now you have started to working on say maybe some low manufacturing product to be manufactured on that particular site or plant. Now those kind of changes will impact you. You may have decided to discontinue any particular line operation or any particular type of business. So those are the things which you need to assess before concluding whether you have any indication yes or no. So these are some of the examples given in standard, but there may be more indicators which may be relevant in your case. So just keep your eyes and ears open and do evaluation very thoroughly before you get into a recoverable assessment situation, a recoverable amount assessment. If you are in doubt, you don't know whether you need to do that assessment or you don't need to do that assessment, please go for recoverable amount determination conclusion, because that is the test which will help you determining, because if your recoverable amount determination is more anyway, you don't have any impairment. So if you are in doubt at the indicator assessment level that whether you should go for recoverable amount determination, please go for recoverable amount determination. Now, let me just look at this chat box if there are any questions till now, because see, this is very important. This is first step for any standard, and if you're working for a company or if you are advising any company, this can save a lot of time, okay, from overall perspective, because if there is no indication and you still ask company to prepare recoverable amount estimation, that will take significant amount of time and cost and effort. But if your assessment is fine and you don't need to do it as per indicator assessment, then that is very well advisable. Cash generating asset and corporate asset, there is a comment that can be covered through example. We will be covering that in subsequent slide. Just hold on. We're just going through the definition and some of the principles, and then we will cover cash generating unit in detail with 2 examples on presentation. So we have talked about the indicator assessment. Now let us assume, so you will go to this measurement of recoverable amount once you conclude in your indicator assessment that yes, there is an indication that asset may be impaired. Now, once you have it, as we saw in definition, that what is recoverable amount is the higher of net selling price or value in use. Now, it is not always necessary that you determine both, because just because the definition is higher of an asset. Sometimes you may conclude that value in use is always higher. So last time I did the estimate and it came out to be 100 carrying amount, and recoverable amount came to be 120 or 130, and my net selling price is generally higher than my value in use. In that case, you don't need to do both computation every year. You can always say that, okay, yes, I will do one, and that is considered to be enough for my impairment test purpose. You don't need to determine, because this is not for your sale transaction. This is only to do assessment that whether you need to record any impairment or not. Now, net selling price, how will you determine net selling price? The best evidence of a net selling price is when you have a binding agreement. But generally, when you are doing, if you are using it for your purpose, then effectively you will not have that binding agreement, right, available. If there is no binding sale agreement, And if it is traded in active market, then the selling price is the asset market price less the cost of disposal. If you already know that, okay, this is what my plant is, and if I put up this particular plant today, this is what my replacement cost is, that's what you will consider, right? Or any kind of a quotation which is available with you, if it is traded in active market, then you can take it. But if it is not traded in active market, right, then it is based on your best information available at the balance sheet date, that at what value it will be traded. So the rule is, if you have binding agreement, that becomes it. If you don't have binding agreement, then you go and look for active market. If you have active market, that's the price. In that case, you cannot go for your best information available and you can say, oh, active market is 85, but my best information is that I will be able to sell at 110. Okay. And the third one is your available information to reflect that amount, what you will get. What is value in use? Value in use is by using it. If you are going to use that particular asset, you will sell your product, whatever is manufactured by using it, and effectively you will end up estimating your future cash flow. Now, once you have that future cash flow, which is inflow and outflow for your estimated useful life, you will have your gross cash flow over a period of time, and then you apply your discounting rate. So this is nothing but your discounted cash flow approach. In measuring value in use, cash flow projection should be based on reasonable and supportable assumption that represents management's best estimate of the set of economic conditions that will exist over the remaining useful life. It should not be driven by what is the situation today. Say, for example, pharmaceutical company. If you are in a pharmaceutical company, we know that, okay, there is a huge demand for a particular type of medicine, which may be a high margin product. Now, you can't just replicate that over a period of 10 years. You need to do that assessment that, okay, how the business condition would be over a 10-year period, not based on your 1 month expectation, that is assumed. Or say, for example, your airline industry may not be going through a very good indication as of today. It's not that everything is gone. So you need to take a reasonable assessment that what economic condition will be over the remaining useful life. And if you have any external evidence, that will always have more weightage. Now, whenever you get into any kind of a DCF, it is always projection, right? And projection can be manipulated. That is always a risk. And effectively, the standard has advised that, okay, whatever is your budget or forecast, you should take it based on the management budgeting and forecast process, what is approved by the management. Management could be a senior level management, a partnership firm, or maybe on overall basis, board of directors, or any other committee which actually approves budget and forecast. Now, we should take that budget or forecast should cover a maximum period of 5 years, unless a longer period can be justified. So what they say is that effectively, once you have projection for 5 years, thereafter it is assumed that you will either have a steady growth or a declining growth, because you cannot predict generally future beyond 5 years. That's what this advice is from standard perspective. However, they have not said that, okay, this is the rule which you cannot overcome or you cannot rebut. This is the general principle. It is expected that you will follow this. But you have a strong indicator, strong evidence that, okay, you can predict future beyond 5 years based on your internal management assessment, and you have strong basis to support that, you can take it. However, it is advised that, okay, after 5 years, you will be moving into steady or declining growth rate. And growth rate should not exceed the long-term average growth rate for the product or industry, unless you have a very, very specific reason to support your higher growth rate than the industry in your product, right, beyond a particular time. So these are some of the factors which are inbuilt in your standard, that to just make sure that, okay, we are careful while determining future. Now, what it should include whatever benefit you will get by using it, whatever you will incur, outflow, and then whatever is the cash inflow or outflow at the time of disposal. It It may be a scrap value, but that you should include if it is material. The second important point is, and this is where lots of people generally struggle. So the standard is saying that since you're testing one particular group of asset or asset on that particular day, it should be evaluated for asset in its current condition. Let us assume you have a factory which has 4 lines, and you are evaluating those 4 lines whether it is usable or not usable, or whether there is an impairment from recoverable amount perspective, and you suddenly add capital expenditure of 5 more lines in that particular factory premises, and you start taking the benefit of any upside which will be generated on use of those 5 lines, is not acceptable from the standard perspective. They say you please take the current condition, use that particular capacity, and then estimate, because you're not testing whether you will be profitable in future. You're testing whether this asset, what I'm deploying, I will be able to recover value at least equal to the carrying amount. So the standard is very clearly saying that, okay, you should estimate your value in use only for asset in its current condition. It should not include the cash inflow or outflow from financing activity, because anyway you're discounting it. Otherwise, it will become a double counting to that extent. And the discount rate could be pre-tax, or generally they have said that, okay, it should be pre-tax. But if you are using your cash flow which is post-tax, then effectively you can also apply post-tax as well. Now, because it was very important topic, let me just go through the chat box if there is any comment. So there is a comment that can we cover a real life example? So if you look at it, Tata Steel. Tata Steel impaired a Chorus when they acquired. Effectively, they impaired that particular asset, recorded 1.5 billion, I think, in total as an impairment. That was a huge impairment which was recorded because whatever price was paid was reflected as a carrying amount prior to impairment recognition, and the recoverable amount was determined to be lower than that carrying amount. And in that case, it was impaired. Uh, if you look at it from outside perspective, lots of these technology companies, they acquire assets, where there is a significant decline in future period, and then that particular impairment is recorded. Bharti recorded impairment for its South African assets, or overall Africa assets, which was acquired. You will see lots of examples like this in your balance sheet, right? When you go through that there is an impairment loss which has been recognized in the books. So when you recognize, so we have covered recognition, we have covered measurement. So we have the carrying amount, which is say 100, and we have say recoverable amount, which may be 80. So in that case, the standard is saying that you recognize loss to the extent of 20. Now, where you will recognize that 20? You will recognize to P&L unless the asset is carried at revalued amount and you are carrying a revaluation reserve. If you are carrying a revaluation reserve, or there is any other balance available other than P&L, then you will offset that first. But otherwise, it will always go through P&L. Now, once you have recognized your your impairment loss, the depreciation or amortization charge for the future period should be adjusted. And that should be nothing but your revised carrying amount minus the residual value, and that's how it should be depreciated over your remaining useful life. Otherwise, it will be double charge, right? If you have recorded 20 as your impairment, then if you keep charging depreciation on the basis of 100, effectively you will end up having either the accelerated depreciation over a period of time, or minus 20 at the end of the year, at the end of the useful life. So if I really sum up, and we will come to the CGU, but if I really sum up this entire impairment assessment, you have only 4 or 5 steps. First one, you determine your asset or a group of asset which can qualify as CGU. So that's your first step. The second step is you determine your carrying amount of the asset or group of assets CGU. The third step is you do your indicator assessment based on external or internal evidence, whether there is an indication of impairment. If the answer to that is yes, there is an indication of impairment, you move ahead. If the answer to that is there is no indication of impairment for that asset or that group of asset, you will end up saying that, okay, yes, we will stop here as far as this year is concerned. That's where your AS 28 compliance is done. But if you have indication, then you go to determination of recoverable amount. What is recoverable amount? It is the higher of net realizable value or value in use. What is net realizable value? Is the selling price minus the cost of disposal. What is value in use? Is the present value of your discounted cash flow which will be generated over the remaining useful life of that asset or asset group. If your carrying amount exceeds your recoverable amount, you have an impairment. Please record that impairment through P&L unless the carrying amount includes a revaluation amount which is adjusted through reserve and other places. In that case, you will do that. Otherwise, you take it through P&L. So I think this is what the crux of the standard is. We will talk about the reversal and CGU determination now, but this is what the crux of the standard. So if you have any particular question till now, we can address it, right? Then we have 3 topics to cover, which is CGU, goodwill, how will you test, when to test, how will you allocate value to goodwill, and the last one will be your reversal of impairment loss. In what situation you can reverse your impairment loss once recognized. So I think there are no questions as of now. So let me just move to CGU. So CGU, as per definition, what we have done is if there is any indication.
Right.
So we will move to CGU assessment when we believe that, okay, that particular asset is not used in independent use, but that is part of the larger CGU or a group of asset. And we have seen that, okay, what is the definition of CGU? The definition of CGU is a group of asset which can generate cash inflow, which is independent of any other CGU or group of assets. Now let us take example. A mining enterprise owns a private railway to support its mining activity. The private railway could be sold only for scrap value, and the private railway does not generate cash inflow from continuing use that are largely independent of the cash inflow from the other assets of the mine. So in this example, if you see, there is a mine. So a mining enterprise owns a private railway, right? And that enterprise is into mining activity. Now the question is whether that private railway can be considered as separate CGU. Now, it is not possible to estimate the recoverable amount of the private railway because the value in use of the private railway cannot be determined, and it is probably different from scrap value. Therefore, the enterprise estimates that the recoverable amount unit to which the private railway belongs is the mining activity. So this is just a very simple example, but you will find that, okay, yes, there will be different examples as well. So let us just go through the second one. A bus company provides services under contract with a municipality that requires minimum service on each of 5 separate routes. Assets devoted to each route and the cash flow from each route can be identified separately. So for each route, there is a bus. For each route, there is a particular inflow. One of the routes operates at a significant loss. So while 4 routes are okay, one route is at significant loss. Now, first read the first line. A bus company provides services under contract with the municipality that requires minimum service on each of 5 separate routes. It means that, okay, there is no choice available that, okay, I can cut down this loss-making route. Because the enterprise does not have the option to curtail any bus route, the lowest level of identifiable cash inflow from continuing use that are largely independent of the cash inflow from other assets or group of assets is cash inflow generated by the 5 routes together. So in that case, you cannot say that, okay, because the asset is there, there is a separate identifiable cash inflow, so I will do an impairment loss for one route, because you don't have any option, because effectively you will lose cash inflow for all 5 routes if you try to cut down one particular route. So the loss on that particular route is compensated by profit on other routes. Similarly, if you come across, let us take 2 more example, live example. Okay, you will have, say, vertically integrated, let us assume, company where one part is manufactured in one plant and then it is used for internal consumption only, let us assume, right? So whether it's an engine used in automotive or any other integration, or say pharmaceutical company, you have, say, bulk drug manufactured, say for example API, and then it is transferred to a dosage form facility. Now this is all effectively internally used. Now in that case, the question is whether you will consider each plant separately, whether engine facility separately, or whether it is this. It all depends whether there is a market available, yes or no. If you can procure engine from somewhere else, and if you can sell whatever is the engine manufactured in that particular plant to someone else, in that case that will become a separate CGU. Otherwise, it will all become one CGU as part of automatic. If it is a separate CGU and if it is only selling to you, then effectively you will come at an arm's length price while doing that assessment on overall basis, and that's how you will do your determination. Similarly, in a retail company, you may have store at airport, which may be a loss-making store. A luxury brand having store at airport or any other prime location, which may be a loss-making store for you. And then you have, say, 50 other stores in that city. Whether you will consider each store separately, because you can always close down a particular store, or whether you will do some other assessment. Now there is diversity in practice on this particular thing. Few companies have taken a view that, okay, yes, each store is separate. Few companies have taken a view that no, the airport store is giving me a publicity while it is a loss-making or prime location store, and that's why my other stores are making money. So effectively, they either do a cross-charge or they consider each cluster or a region as one CGU. So that's how I think the determination and the judgment is involved in CGU determination, and this can actually impact your impairment assessment. Because say for example, in this 5 route for bus, if you would have concluded that yes, each route is CGU, you would have recorded impairment for one. But the very fact that you have not considered each route as a CGU, you are able to avoid any impairment recognition. So there is always a chances of misinterpretation, misjudgment, manipulation, judgment error, in this. So that's why it is very important that that the assessment is supported by facts, an actual situation in a particular thing. It is not that okay, one particular company is doing assessment like this, so similarly you also need to do it. It has to be supported by your business model, your thinking, the facts and circumstances available in your assessment. But CGU determination is very, very important. Now, CGU assessment has to be consistent from period to period, unless a change is justified because either there is a change in your business model or there is anything else. Otherwise, it is expected that you will have a same CGU assessment every period. Now, the rule for recoverable amount and carrying amount for CGU is exactly the same what will be applicable to individual asset as well. So effectively club group of asset carrying amount, and then you effectively take the recoverable amount as CGU as well. Now, carrying amount of cash generating units will always include the carrying amount of those assets which can be directly attributable to that CGU. It will not include any liability unless the recoverable amount of the cash generated unit cannot be determined without considering that particular liability. But otherwise, it is only because the carrying amount has to be only for asset. Let us go through this example. So the crux of this example is that okay, yes, there is a company which is into mining. There is a provision for restoration cost which is 5 million or 50 lakhs, which is equal to the present value of restoration cost. There is an offer from various buyers for 80 lakh rupees, and there is a value in use of mine which is 1 crore 20 lakh rupees. Now the carrying amount of the mine is 1 crore rupees. Okay. Now we need to apply our understanding of impairment standard, and then we will move to the answer. But what are the facts available? And I request everyone to just note down maybe just as a crux. There is a carrying amount which is 1 crore. There is a net realizable value which is 80 lakh rupees, at least the offer. Let us assume there is a net realizable value as of now. There is a value in use which is 1 crore 20 lakh rupees excluding restoration cost. And then there is a restoration cost which is expected to be 50 lakh rupees. Now, what is the recoverable amount in this case? Recoverable amount is 1 crore 20 lakh rupees minus 50, which is 70 lakhs, right? So 1 crore 20 is the value in use, excluding restoration cost. So the company has to incur restoration cost at the end of the year. So that will take 70 lakh rupees. So your value in use becomes 70 lakh rupees. Effectively, you have 80 lakh rupees as your net selling price. What will be your impairment? What will be your impairment in this case? Let me go through chat. So you can write your answer on chat. there is one response where it is saying that, okay, yes, there is no impairment. Whether there will be an impairment, what is the rule for impairment? The rule for impairment is you calculate first your recoverable amount. What is the recoverable amount? It is 80 lakh rupees or 70 lakh rupees, whichever is higher, right? That's what the rule is. So in this example, it will be 80 lakh rupees. What is the carrying amount? 1 crore minus 50 lakhs. Sorry. Carrying amount is 1 crore minus 50 lakhs, right? So 70 lakhs is higher than 50 lakh rupees. So effectively, you have no impairment. But if you would have not considered this 50 lakh rupees adjustment to your carrying amount, you would have recorded your impairment. Now, from goodwill perspective, so just to recap that, okay, while carrying value you will always have for property, plant and equipment and other stuff, the goodwill is applicable when you either do amalgamation or acquisition, you record goodwill. Now, goodwill is something which has to be allocated to a CGU. It cannot be allocated to a particular asset. So goodwill is always, so from goodwill perspective, the accounting unit at which the goodwill has to be accounted for is always at CGU level. So whatever is the CGU, this is where you allocate your goodwill. So say for example, if you have acquired a multinational company which has operations across the globe, and each country is considered as CGU, separate CGU. So whatever is the consolidated goodwill, that has to be allocated to each CGU. Right? So that's the general rule. So what the standard says is that when you are testing for impairment, because sometimes from accounting perspective, you always have your goodwill sitting in your consolidated books. You never have goodwill allocated to respective books of the countries. And that's why it will never be included in your carrying amount. So what it says is that you can do either a bottom-up testing. Bottom-up testing means that you test individuals, reporting units or CGU at their recoverable value, and whatever is the recoverable value over there, you keep adding it up. Okay, or you do a top-down approach. So when you actually do a bottom-up test, you identify the carrying value of goodwill which can be allocated to the cash generating unit under review. So effectively do the allocation. So let us assume your total goodwill at a consolidated level is 1000 crore and you had 20 CGUs hypothetically. So let us assume that that you have allocated on a simplified assumption basis 50 crore each. So you add that 50 crore to the carrying value when you are doing the test. And then you compare the recoverable amount of that cash generated unit against carrying amount, recoverable value against the carrying amount, including the goodwill value. So this is called the bottom-up test approach, that each lowest level, you're testing your goodwill test impairment, and that's how your testing is done. Now, if you have not allocated the carrying amount of goodwill on a reasonable and consistent basis under review, then let us assume if you are not able to allocate, whatever may be the reason, then you should also perform a top-down test. How will you do the top-down test? Identify the smallest CGU to which the goodwill can be allocated on a reasonable and consistent basis. Now, you may say that I may not be able to allocate in our example 20 countries, but we can do maybe to 5 continents separately. Let us assume hypothetically. Okay. So for Europe, I can do. For America, I can do. For Asia, I can do. And similarly, you can do it. Let us assume so in that case, what is the lowest level at which you can do it is by continent. So effectively, any entity which is coming within that continent, you can do that assessment. So that becomes your largest cash generating unit. And in that case, compare the recoverable amount of the largest with the carrying amount of all plus the allocated goodwill. That's how you go to the top down. If you say that, okay, I cannot allocate goodwill to be based on anything to any country or any continent or any region, only at a company level I can have it, and you need to justify that reason, okay, that rationale. In that case, you do the adding up of all carrying amount, you do the adding up of all recoverable value, and then you add goodwill to the carrying amount, and then do the comparison. But it is expected that if you have independent cash flow, if you have done a CGU determination, you should be able to allocate goodwill on a reasonable basis to each CGU. Because once you start getting into aggregation, the biggest risk is one CGU may require impairment, while other may have upside, and both of them will offset each other, and impairment will never be recognized, even though the business is not in a good condition. Now, there was one question earlier that, okay, how should we do about corporate assets? Now, corporate assets include group of divisional assets such as building of headquarter division, which cannot be recognized or allocated, let us assume. Now, in that case, generally you will end up doing a top-up approach, and then you will not do the allocation. Whatever is the surplus available, that's how you will compare. After doing this goodwill and other assessment, you will add up everything and compare against corporate asset whether you have enough recoverable value. Now, how should you recognize a impairment loss against assets? So let us assume at a CGU level, which has goodwill as well as other balances, and you have determined that, okay, 20 will be the impairment loss. So the method in standard is first you allocate to goodwill. Let us assume we have goodwill balance of 15 in that 100 of carrying amount. Then out of 20, 15 will be allocated against goodwill, and then 5 will be allocated to other assets on a pro rata basis based on the carrying amount. And that's how you will do that assessment. Whenever you are doing this allocation, the net asset, the carrying amount of the asset should not be below net selling price or its value in use, and it should not be below zero. Please make sure that we don't end up in a negative asset value. We should do the reassessment at each balance sheet date, and if there is any indication that an impairment loss recognized for an asset in prior accounting period may no longer exist or may have decreased, in any such situation, you can reverse that particular impairment loss, which was recognized in earlier period, by estimating the recoverable amount of that asset. So we'll be happy to take if there are any questions relating to impairment. Otherwise, we'll move to disclosures. So I think one of the important point to be disclosed is is the impairment loss recognized in the statement of profit and loss during the period, and the line item of statement of profit and loss in which those impairment losses are included. So exactly where in P&L that impairment loss is included, and for each class of asset we should recognize that how much is the impairment loss which has been recognized. What is the amount of reversal of impairment loss recognized in the current period? How much is the impairment loss directly adjusted against revaluation surplus? How much was the impairment loss which was earlier recognized, which has been reversed against revaluation surplus? And if you are reporting a segment as well, then how much is the impairment loss recognized for each segment, or how much of the impairment loss reversed for each segment? So that is also applicable. if you have recognized any impairment loss in the current period, then you should also give a commentary and notes saying that, okay, what was the event and which triggered this impairment loss or reversal of impairment loss, the amount of the impairment loss recognized or reversed, and for an individual asset, the nature of the asset, and for the reportable segment to which that asset belongs. And similarly for CGU, and then you should also disclose that, okay, how a CGU is identified and in a company. I think these were the broad principles from impairment perspective, and we'll be happy to address if you want anything to be clarified further, or if there are any specific questions, because we have some time left now.
Yes, sir. Any questions, sir? I think मेरे को स्क्रीन में जो दिख रहा है, मुकेश मित्तल सर, केके जैन सर, संजय गर्ग सर, प्रेमदान सर, अनिल जोशी जी, आनंद कुमार जैन जी. I have changed the settings. You can also unmute yourself.
So I think there are no questions. If there are no questions, then thank you very much from my side. It was a pleasure interacting with you and sharing my experience with you.
ये कह रहा है गया नहीं, ये कह रहा है चला गया.
And wish you a good health in these challenging times, because that's the most important thing from everyone's perspective.
Sir, in fact, we would like to extend my special thanks on behalf of Sonipat branch and all the members who have joined this seminar to you. This was actually a wonderful seminar for all the members who have joined, and I can assure you that they must have learned insights about all the practical aspects. And really, thank you so much, Praveen Tulsianji, for joining us. It is always a matter of pride and honor for us to have you with Sonipat branch. So, in fact, I also want to make one announcement that we are also going to organize a seminar on loan advances, deposits, and intercorporate loans with Corporate Laws and Corporate Governance Committee of ICAI on coming 26th May at 3 p.m. to 5 p.m. So we'll also be sharing that link with all the members. So would request all the members to join that seminar as well. And once again, thank you so much, Praveen Tulsianji, for giving this wonderful deliberation. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And thank you so much, all the members who have joined this seminar.
Thank you. Thank you, sir. Thank you. Namaskar.